when a heartbroken widower shocked an entire Colorado mining town by spending his dead wife's inheritance on a desperate family of 7 at a debt auction. Everyone thought grief had finally driven him mad. But what Samuel Hartwell did with the legal papers that made him owner of 7 human souls would challenge everything the frontier community believed about justice, family, and the true cost of compassion. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to the Rocky Mountain peaks like ghostly fingers as Samuel Hartwell guided his wagon down the winding trail toward Silver Ridge. 3.5 months had passed since he'd laid his beloved wife Eleanor to rest in the small cemetery overlooking their ranch, and the world still felt hollow without her gentle presence. The October air carried the sharp bite of approaching winter, and Samuel pulled his wool coat tighter around his shoulders as he contemplated the grim business that had brought him to town. Silver Ridge had grown from a small mining camp to a bustling frontier town in just 5 years, fueled by the discovery of silver veins in the surrounding mountains. The main street bustled with activity, even at this early hour, miners heading to their claims, merchants opening their shops, and families going about their daily routines. But Samuel barely noticed the familiar sights. His mind was consumed by memories of Eleanor's final weeks, when the consumption had stolen her strength bit by bit until she was nothing but spirit and determination in a failing body. "Promise me something, Samuel," she had whispered during one of those last precious nights, her hand so light in his that he feared she might float away like dandelion seeds in the wind. "Promise me you won't let the sadness turn you bitter. The world has enough bitter men already. Find a way to do some good with the years you have left," he had promised, of course. A man promises his dying wife anything she asks, even when he can't imagine how he'll keep such a vow. But in the months since her funeral, Samuel had struggled to find purpose in anything. The ranch felt empty despite being filled with cattle and horses. The house echoed with silence, where Eleanor's laughter once filled every room. Even his favorite activities, reading by the fireplace, tending his garden, working with his hands, had lost their appeal. Samuel's wagon creaked to a stop outside Henderson's general store, where he tied his horses to the hitching post. The familiar bustle of Silver Ridge surrounded him, but he moved through it like a man walking underwater. Mrs. Patterson, the banker's wife, nodded politely from across the street, though he could see the pity in her eyes. Everyone in town knew about his loss, and their well-meaning sympathy had become another burden to bear. "Morning, Samuel," called out Tom Fletcher, the town's blacksmith, as he emerged from his shop with an armload of horseshoes. "Good to see you in town. How are you holding up?" "Well enough," Samuel replied, though the words felt like stones in his mouth. Tom meant well, but Samuel had grown weary of such conversations. People wanted to help, but there was no help for the kind of emptiness that had settled in his chest like a permanent winter. As Samuel gathered his supplies from Henderson's store, he overheard hushed conversations about the day's scheduled auction. Debt auctions were grim affairs, but they had become increasingly common as more families struggled to survive in the harsh mountain territory. Drought had ruined many crops. Mining accidents had left widows and orphans with unpaid bills, and the territorial government offered little assistance to those who fell behind on their obligations. "Shame about the Caldwell family," Mrs. Henderson murmured to another customer as she weighed out Samuel's order of flour. 7 mouths to feed and no way to pay what they owe. That oldest boy tried everything, worked double shifts at the mine, took on carpentry jobs, even sold their milk cow. But when sickness takes the breadwinner, what's a family to do? Samuel's ears perked up despite himself. He'd heard the name Caldwell before, a hard-working family that had settled in the valley. about 2 years ago. The father had been a skilled carpenter until a mining accident crushed his leg, leaving him unable to work. The family had struggled on for months, but medical bills and mounting debts had finally overwhelmed them. "How many children?" asked the other customer, her voice heavy with sympathy. "6, ranging from about 5 years old to 17, plus the mother, of course. Poor woman looks like she's aged 10 years in the past 6 months. Can't imagine what it must be like, knowing your family might be split up and sold to different buyers." The casual mention of separating a family sent a chill through Samuel's bones. He'd always known that debt auctions existed, but he'd never really considered the human cost. The terror of children being torn away from their mothers, the desperation of parents unable to protect their young ones. It was the kind of systematic cruelty that Eleanor would have found unconscionable. Samuel completed his purchases in thoughtful silence, his mind churning with possibilities he didn't yet fully understand. As he loaded his supplies into the wagon, he found himself thinking about Eleanor's words again. She had always been the moral compass of their marriage, the one who saw injustice and demanded action while he preferred to mind his own business and avoid complications. But perhaps avoiding complications had been a luxury he could afford, only when Eleanor was alive to handle the complications for him. She had been the one who organized relief efforts for struggling families, who visited the sick and elderly, who made sure their ranch was always open to those who needed help. Without her gentle insistence, Samuel had retreated into his own grief, contributing nothing to the community that had supported him for 15 years. The auction was scheduled to begin at 2 o'clock in the town square, giving Samuel several hours to wrestle with the idea that was taking shape in his mind. He spent the morning wandering Silver Ridge's streets, observing the preparations with a mixture of fascination and horror. A wooden platform had been erected in the center of the square, and official notices were posted on every corner listing the families and individuals who would be offered for sale to satisfy their debts. Samuel read the notices with growing unease. There were names he recognized, neighbors who had fallen on hard times, children he'd seen playing in the streets, mothers who had shopped alongside Eleanor at the general store. The legal language was cold and clinical, reducing human lives to assets that could be transferred to the highest bidder. As noon approached, Samuel found himself sitting on a bench outside the courthouse, watching as potential buyers began to gather in the square. Some were ranchers looking for cheap labor, others were businessmen seeking domestic help or skilled workers. A few appeared to be decent folks who might treat their purchases fairly, but others had the hard look of men who viewed human beings as livestock to be worked until they broke. Samuel recognized several faces in the crowd. There was Jeremiah Stone, who owned the largest cattle operation in the territory and was known for his harsh treatment of hired hands. Bradley Pierce ran a mining operation where accidents were frequent and safety measures were minimal. Most disturbing was the presence of Victor Hawthorne, who operated what he called a boarding house in the next town over, though everyone knew it was something much darker. The sight of these men evaluating potential purchases like they were inspecting cattle made Samuel's stomach turn. He thought about Eleanor again, remembering how she had once insisted they take in a young woman whose husband had died in a mining accident, despite the whispers and gossip such charity had generated. "Every person deserves dignity," Eleanor had said when Samuel had expressed concern about what their neighbors might think. "If we have the means to help and choose not to, what does that say about who we are?" Now, sitting in the autumn sunshine and watching predators circle their prey, Samuel understood what Eleanor would have expected of him. The realization was both terrifying and liberating. He had spent months feeling useless and purposeless, but here was a situation where his resources could make a real difference. The inheritance money from Eleanor's family, nearly $800 that he'd been keeping in their bedroom safe, suddenly seemed less like a burden and more like an opportunity. Samuel stood up from the bench and walked purposefully toward the bank. If he was going to do this insane thing, he would need to withdraw enough cash to make a serious bid. The banker, Robert Patterson, looked surprised to see him requesting such a large sum. "Planning a major purchase, Samuel?" Patterson asked as he counted out the bills. $800 is quite a substantial amount. "You could say that," Samuel replied, tucking the money into his coat's inner pocket. "Eleanor always said money was meant to be used for important things, not hoarded like a dragon's treasure." Patterson nodded approvingly. "Your wife was a wise woman. I'm sure whatever you're planning, she'd be proud." Samuel hoped that was true, though he suspected Eleanor might have had some choice words about the risks he was about to take. But she had also taught him that some risks were worth taking when human lives were at stake. By the time Samuel returned to the town square, a considerable crowd had gathered around the auction platform. Families clustered together with their few remaining possessions, trying to maintain dignity in circumstances that stripped away nearly everything else. Children clung to their parents' hands, and Samuel could see the fear in their young faces, even if they didn't fully understand what was happening. Then he saw them, the Caldwell family, standing near the back of the group, with the resigned posture of people who had exhausted all other options. The mother, Rebecca Caldwell, was a woman of perhaps 35 years, though hardship had carved lines around her eyes that made her appear older. Her dark hair was neatly braided, and her simple blue dress had been carefully mended in several places. Despite everything, she held herself with a quiet dignity that reminded Samuel painfully of Eleanor. The children ranged in age from a small boy who couldn't have been more than 5 to a teenage girl who was nearly a woman. There were twin boys who appeared to be around 10, a serious-looking girl of perhaps 12, another boy who might have been 14, and the oldest daughter who was trying to comfort the younger ones while battling her own obvious fear. Samuel watched them for several minutes, studying their faces and trying to imagine what they must be feeling. The youngest boy kept asking his mother questions in a whisper, clearly confused about why they were standing in the town square with all their belongings packed into a single wagon. The teenage daughter had tears streaming down her cheeks that she kept wiping away, trying to be strong for her siblings. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. It was Rebecca Caldwell's expression that finally convinced Samuel to act. She stood perfectly still, her arms wrapped protectively around her youngest child, but her eyes held the desperate alertness of a mother animal defending her cubs. She was scanning the crowd of potential buyers, trying to assess which of them might treat her children with basic decency, knowing that her opinion would matter little once the bidding began. Samuel felt Eleanor's presence beside him as surely as if she had taken his arm. This was why she had made him promise to do good in the world, not for grand gestures or public recognition, but for moments like this when ordinary people faced extraordinary hardship and needed someone to care enough to help. The auctioneer, a thin man named Clifford Mills, who traveled between territories, conducting such sales, stepped onto the platform and called for attention. His voice carried across the square with practiced authority as he explained the legal procedures and payment terms. Samuel barely heard the words, too focused on the growing knot of determination in his chest. "First lot," Mills announced, consulting. "His ledger will be the Hutchins family, mother and 3 children ages 6 to 14. Excellent domestic workers, all in good health. Bidding will start at $15. Samuel watched in horror as the Hutchins family was led onto the platform. Mrs. Hutchins, a frail woman with prematurely grey hair, held her children close, while men in the crowd evaluated them like livestock. The bidding was brisk but not enthusiastic, finally ending at $42, when a rancher from the next valley bought the family to work his spread. One by one, other families were sold. Samuel observed the process with growing revulsion, noting how children were separated from parents when buyers wanted only specific family members, how elderly grandparents were left unbid upon because they were considered too old to be useful. The casual cruelty of it all made him think of Eleanor's stories about the Underground Railroad, how brave people had risked everything to help strangers escape slavery. This wasn't slavery in the traditional sense, Samuel knew. These families would theoretically be working to pay off debts rather than being owned outright. But the practical difference seemed minimal when children could be torn from their mother's arms and sold to men who might work them to death. "Next lot," Mills called out, and Samuel's attention snapped back to the platform. The Caldwell family, Nabu, 7 souls in total, Mother Rebecca, skilled in cooking, cleaning, and household management. Children ages 5 to 17, all healthy and willing workers. Rebecca Caldwell squared her shoulders and led her children onto the platform with as much dignity as she could muster. The youngest boy clung to her skirt, while the older children formed a protective circle around their siblings. Samuel could see the terror in their eyes, though they were all trying to be brave. The family comes with basic household goods, including cooking implements and bedding, Mills continued. Mrs. Caldwell has excellent references for domestic work, and the older children are experienced in farm labor and carpentry. Bidding starts at $25 for the complete family unit. Samuel felt his heart hammering against his ribs as hands began to raise around the square. 25 became 30, then 35, as various buyers considered the potential value of 7 workers. He recognized some of the bidders and felt sick thinking about what life would be like for the Caldwell children under their authority. Jeremiah Stone raised his hand. $40. Victor Hawthorne immediately countered. $50. Samuel's hand moved almost without conscious thought. $100. The entire crowd turned to stare at him, and a murmur of surprise rippled through the square. $100 was far more than anyone had paid for any family that day, enough to make even the most determined buyers reconsider their interest. Mills looked startled, but recovered quickly. $100 from Mr. Hartwell. Do I hear 110? Stone and Hawthorne exchanged glances, clearly caught off guard by the unexpected competition. Samuel stood perfectly still, his face showing none of the emotional turmoil churning beneath the surface. On the platform, Rebecca Caldwell was staring at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. Hope mixed with wariness, gratitude tempered by fear of what this stranger might want from her family. 120, Stone called out. Reluctantly, Samuel didn't hesitate. $200. Gasps echoed across the square. $200 was more than most families in Silver Ridge saw in 6 months, an astronomical sum for a debt auction purchase. Even Mills seemed shaken by the bid, having to clear his throat before continuing. $200, Mills announced. Do I hear 210? The silence stretched on for what felt like hours, but was probably only 30 seconds. Stone shook his head and stepped back into the crowd. Hawthorne glared at Samuel with obvious hostility, but made no further bid. No one else seemed willing to compete with such an extraordinary offer. $200 going once, Mills called out. Going twice. His hammer began to descend toward the podium. Sold to Mr. Samuel Hartwell for $200. As the sound of the gavel echoed across the town square, Samuel realized there was no going back. In the span of 5 minutes, he had legally purchased 7 human beings and bound their lives to his decision. Whatever happened next would determine whether Eleanor's faith in his capacity for good had been justified or tragically misplaced. Rebecca Caldwell was still staring at him from the platform, her arms wrapped protectively around her youngest, and child while her other children pressed close beside her. Samuel could see questions in her eyes, questions about his motives, his character, and what kind of life awaited her family under his authority. Samuel had no answers for those questions. Yet, all he knew was that he had acted on the certainty that some things were worth risking everything for, and that Eleanor's voice in his heart had guided him toward the most important decision of his life. The wagon wheels crunched through fallen leaves as Samuel guided his horses away from Silver Ridge, the weight of 7 additional lives pressing down on him more heavily than any physical burden he'd ever carried. Behind him, the Caldwell family sat in stunned silence among their meager possessions, trying to process what had just transpired and what it might mean for their future. Rebecca Caldwell occupied the seat beside Samuel, her posture rigid with tension despite his invitation for her to sit up front. Her youngest child, little Nathan, had fallen asleep in her lap, exhausted by the emotional turmoil of the day. The other children huddled together in the wagon bed. 17-year-old Grace, with her arm protectively around 14-year-old Michael, the twin boys Joseph and Joshua whispering to each other in voices too low to hear, and 12-year-old Sarah staring at the passing landscape with wide, uncertain eyes. "Mr. Hartwell," Rebecca finally spoke, her voice carefully controlled, but tinged with the strain of someone trying to maintain composure. "I need to understand what you expect from us, what kind of arrangement you have in mind." Samuel had been dreading this conversation while simultaneously knowing it was inevitable. How could he explain his impulsive decision when he wasn't entirely sure he understood it himself? How could he reassure a terrified mother without making promises he might not be able to keep? "Mrs. Caldwell," he began, then paused, wrestling with how much to reveal about his own confusion. "I'll be honest with you. I'm not entirely certain what comes next. I acted on instinct back there, not on any carefully laid plan." He felt her tense beside him and immediately regretted his words. A woman who had just watched her family sold at auction didn't need to hear that their purchaser was making things up as he went along. "What I mean," Samuel continued quickly, "is that I didn't buy your family because I needed workers or servants. I bought you because the alternative, watching men like Stone or Hawthorne take you, seemed unthinkable." Rebecca was quiet for a long moment, processing this information. "So what happens when we reach your property? Do we work off the debt you paid for us? Are we free to leave if we choose? I need to know what to tell my children." The directness of her questions forced Samuel to confront the legal and practical realities of what he'd done. According to territorial law, he now owned the labor of 7 people until they worked off a debt of $200 plus interest. Depending on the terms he set, that could take years or even decades. Alternatively, he could simply release them immediately, though that would leave them with nowhere to go and no means of support as winter approached. "My ranch is about 8 miles from town," Samuel said, buying time while he thought. "It's not fancy, but there's plenty of room and enough work to keep everyone busy. The main house has 4 bedrooms, and there's a bunkhouse that could be made comfortable for some of the children." He paused, glancing at Grace, who was listening intently, to every word, despite pretending to focus on comforting her younger siblings. At 17, she was old enough to understand the precarious nature of their situation and the various dangers they might face. "As for the arrangement," Samuel continued, "I suppose we'll have to figure that out together. I'm not in the habit of owning people, Mrs. Caldwell. It sits poorly with my conscience and would have horrified my late wife." The mention of his wife seemed to soften something in Rebecca's expression. "I'm sorry for your loss," she said quietly. "When did she pass?" 3 months ago. Consumption. The words still came out rough, like speaking around broken glass in his throat. Eleanor was. She was the kind of person who couldn't stand to see suffering without trying to help. I think she would have approved of what I did today, even if she might have questioned my methods. Little Nathan stirred in his mother's lap, blinking up at Samuel with curious blue eyes. "Are you our new papa?" he asked, with the innocent directness that only small children possess. The question sent a jolt through Samuel's chest, and he saw Rebecca's face flush with embarrassment. "Nathan, that's not Mr. Hartwell is. We need to be respectful," she stammered. But Samuel found himself smiling for the first time in months. "What's your name, son?" "Nathan James Caldwell," the boy replied solemnly. "I'm 5 years old, and I can help with chores. Mama says I'm very good at feeding chickens." "Nathan James is a fine name," Samuel said, "and I happen to have chickens that need feeding. They're not very bright, so they appreciate patient helpers." The easy interaction seemed to break some of the tension in the wagon. Samuel heard one of the twins giggle softly, and even Grace's stern expression relaxed slightly. But he could see that Rebecca remained wary, still trying to assess what kind of man had purchased her family and what he might want in return. As they traveled deeper into the mountain valley where Samuel's ranch was located, he found himself pointing out landmarks and sharing stories about the area. He told them about the creek that ran behind his house, fed by snowmelt from the peaks and cold enough to numb your feet even in summer. He described the meadow where wildflowers bloomed in spring, creating a carpet of color that Eleanor had loved to paint during their happier years. "Do you have horses?" asked Michael, speaking up for the first time since leaving town. "Several," Samuel replied, "along with cattle, pigs, and those chickens Nathan mentioned. It's more animals than one man needs, really. Eleanor always said we should get some of the neighbor children to help with them, but—" He trailed off, realizing that he'd been unconsciously isolating himself since Eleanor's death, turning away. Offers of help and companionship in favor of solitary grief. The irony wasn't lost on him that he'd now acquired a house full of people who would make isolation impossible. "I know something about horses," Grace said hesitantly. "My father taught me to ride and care for them before his accident." Samuel turned to look at her more closely. Grace Caldwell had her mother's dark hair and serious expression, but there was something in her eyes that spoke of resilience and intelligence. At 17, she was caught in the terrible position of being old enough to understand their family's dire circumstances, but too young to do much about them. "I'd welcome the help," Samuel said. "I've got a mare named Buttercup who's been feeling neglected lately. She might enjoy having someone young and energetic to fuss over her." The conversation continued as they wound through the mountain valley, with even the quieter children gradually beginning to ask questions about their destination. Samuel learned that Joseph and Joshua, the 10-year-old twins, were passionate about fishing and had been disappointed to leave their favorite stream behind. Sarah, the 12-year-old, loved to read but had been forced to sell most of her books to help pay family debts. Michael had been apprenticing with a carpenter before his father's accident ended that opportunity. With each revelation about their interrupted lives and abandoned dreams, Samuel felt the weight of responsibility growing heavier on his shoulders. These weren't abstract people in need of rescue. They were individuals with hopes, fears, talents, and personalities that had been shaped by circumstances beyond their control. As the sun began to sink toward the western peaks, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that reminded Samuel painfully of Eleanor's watercolors, they finally reached the entrance to his ranch. The property stretched across nearly 300 acres of valley floor and hillside, with the main house situated on a gentle rise that provided views in all directions. Samuel's house was larger than most frontier dwellings, built from local timber and stone with a wide front porch and multiple chimneys. Eleanor had insisted on the extra bedrooms when they'd built it 12 years ago, hoping to fill them with children who had never come. Now, for the first time, those empty rooms would serve their intended purpose. "It's beautiful," Rebecca said, softly, and Samuel caught something wistful in her voice that suggested she was thinking of the modest home her family had lost. "Eleanor designed most of it," Samuel replied. "She had strong opinions about how a house should welcome people." As they pulled up to the front porch, Samuel noticed how the children's eyes widened as they took in the size of the house and the well-maintained outbuildings. For a family that had been living in a single-room cabin for the past year, his ranch probably seemed impossibly grand. "Everyone out," Samuel said, climbing down from the wagon. "Let's get you settled before it gets too dark to see properly." The process of unloading the wagon revealed just how little the Caldwell family had been able to salvage from their previous life. Their possessions fit into a few bundles and one small trunk: clothes, a Bible, some basic cooking implements, and a few precious items they hadn't been able to bear leaving behind. Samuel carried Nathan, while Rebecca gathered their belongings, and the other children followed in a small procession toward the front door. As they stepped onto the porch, Samuel realized this was the first time since Eleanor's funeral that other people had entered his house as anything more than brief visitors. The main room of the house was spacious and comfortable, with a large stone fireplace and furniture that Eleanor had chosen for both beauty and practicality. But Samuel suddenly saw it through the eyes of people who had lost everything, and he wondered if his comparative wealth made them feel even more vulnerable and displaced. "There are 4 bedrooms upstairs," Samuel explained, lighting oil lamps to push back the gathering darkness. "Mrs. Caldwell, you and Nathan can take the largest one. It has its own washstand and a good view of the mountains. Grace, you can have the room that Eleanor used for her painting. The boys can share the 2 remaining rooms however they'd like." He paused, realizing he was making assumptions about their comfort level with these arrangements. "Or if you'd prefer, to stay closer together, we can work out something different. I want you to feel safe," Rebecca finished quietly. "You want us to feel safe?" "Yes," Samuel admitted, "though I understand that might take time." As they explored the house, Samuel watched the children's reactions with interest. The twins were fascinated by the indoor water pump in the kitchen, having been accustomed to drawing water from a well. Sarah gravitated immediately toward the bookshelf in the main room, her eyes lighting up when she saw the collection of novels and poetry volumes that Eleanor had treasured. Michael examined the craftsmanship of the furniture with the appreciation of someone who understood woodworking, but it was Grace who surprised Samuel the most. While her siblings explored with the natural curiosity of children, she moved through the house with the careful observation of someone taking inventory, noting exits and assessing potential threats. Her behavior reminded Samuel uncomfortably that this young woman had probably spent months trying to protect her family from dangers he could barely imagine. "Grace," he said gently, "what are you thinking about?" She startled slightly, as if caught doing something inappropriate. "I'm sorry, Mr. Hartwell. I didn't mean to be nosy. It's just, your house is very fine, and I was wondering—" "What you were wondering," Samuel prompted when she trailed off. "I was wondering what you'll want us to do to earn our keep," she said bluntly, "and whether you'll expect us to stay together as a family, or if you'll want to make other arrangements." The fear behind her carefully neutral words hit Samuel like a physical blow. This young woman was asking, as diplomatically as she could manage, whether he intended to abuse his legal authority over her family, whether he would separate them, overwork them, or worse. Samuel knelt down so he was at eye level with Grace, wanting her to see his face clearly when he answered. "Grace, I want you to listen to me very carefully. I bought your family because I couldn't stand the thought of what might happen to you otherwise. I'm not going to separate you, I'm not going to overwork you, and I'm sure as hell not going to hurt any of you." He saw tears start to form in her eyes, though she fought to keep them from falling. "But what do you want from us, then? Nobody spends $200 without expecting something in return." It was a fair question, and Samuel found himself thinking of Eleanor again, remembering conversations they'd had about the obligations that came with privilege and resources. She had always believed that those who had more than they needed were morally bound to help those who had less, but she'd also understood that charity without dignity could be its own form of cruelty. "What I want," Samuel said slowly, "is for your family to help me figure out how to honor my wife's memory by doing something good in this world." She believed that every person deserved a chance to build a life worth living, and I'd like to see if we can make that happen here. Before Grace could respond, Nathan came running into the room with his arms full of kindling from the woodpile. "Outside, Mr. Samuel," he called excitedly. "I helped. Mama said we should make a fire because it's getting cold." Samuel smiled and ruffled the boy's hair. "That's excellent work, Nathan. A warm house makes everything better." As the family gathered around the fireplace while Samuel built up the fire, he realized that something fundamental had shifted in the last hour. These people were no longer abstract recipients of his charity. They were individuals with their own personalities, fears, and hopes. Nathan's innocent enthusiasm, Grace's protective vigilance, the twins' quiet curiosity, Sarah's love of books, Michael's careful politeness, and Rebecca's fierce maternal love had all combined to create something Samuel hadn't experienced in months: a sense of purpose beyond his own grief. But even as he felt this warming sense of connection, Samuel knew that the hardest challenges lay ahead. Legal ownership was one thing, but building trust and creating a functional household from a group of strangers was another matter entirely. And somewhere in the back of his mind, he couldn't shake the feeling that men like Stone and Hawthorne wouldn't simply accept their defeat at the auction without attempting some form of retaliation. As the fire crackled to life and cast dancing shadows on the walls, Samuel caught Rebecca watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read. There was still wariness there, but also something that might have been the beginning of hope. For the first time since Eleanor's death, Samuel felt like he might be capable of keeping the promise he'd made to her about doing good in the world. The road ahead would undoubtedly be complicated, but as he listened to the sound of children's voices filling his house again, Samuel thought that perhaps complicated was exactly what he needed. Dawn broke crisp and clear over the Rocky Mountain Valley, painting the peaks in brilliant shades of gold and rose that would have taken Eleanor's breath away. Samuel stood at his bedroom window, coffee cup in hand, watching smoke rise from the kitchen chimney below. The first time in months that someone other than himself had stirred the fires of his house awake. The sounds drifting up from downstairs were equally foreign to his recent experience. The gentle clatter of dishes being arranged, water being pumped at the kitchen sink, and most remarkably, the soft murmur of conversation between Rebecca and Grace as they worked together to prepare breakfast for their expanded household. Samuel had slept fitfully, his mind churning with questions about how to navigate this unprecedented situation. What did one do with a family of 7 people who were legally bound to his service but morally deserving of their freedom? How did he balance his desire to help with their need for dignity and autonomy? The legal documents in his coat pocket gave him absolute authority over their lives, yet everything Eleanor had taught him about human decency argued against exercising such power. A soft knock at his door interrupted his contemplation. "Mr. Hartwell?" came Grace's voice, carefully, respectful but tinged with urgency. "I'm sorry to disturb you, sir, but there's a situation downstairs that might require your attention." Samuel quickly dressed and descended to find the main room in organized chaos. Rebecca was attempting to corral Nathan away from the fireplace. while simultaneously trying to mediate a heated argument between the twins and Michael about whose turn it was to feed the chickens. Sarah sat at the kitchen table with tears streaming down her face, clutching a water-damaged book that had apparently suffered some mishap involving the coffee pot. "What seems to be the problem?" Samuel asked, surveying the scene with bewildered amusement. "The problem," Grace said with the exasperated tone of someone who had been trying to maintain order among siblings for far too long, "is that nobody knows what they're supposed to be doing. Michael thinks he should be chopping wood because that's men's work, but Joshua says he's perfectly capable of handling an axe. Joseph wants to explore the creek, but Nathan insists on following him everywhere, and Sarah accidentally knocked over the coffee pot trying to reach a book on the high shelf." Samuel looked around at the assembled faces, some defiant, some embarrassed, all uncertain, and realized that he was witnessing the natural adjustment period of a family trying to establish routines in an unfamiliar environment. These children had lost not just their home, but their sense of structure and purpose. They were grasping for familiar roles and responsibilities in a world where everything had changed. "Well," Samuel said, settling into a chair at the kitchen table and gesturing for everyone to gather around, "it sounds like we need to have a family meeting." The word family hung in the air for a moment, and Samuel saw various reactions flicker across their faces. Nathan beamed with delight at being included in such grown-up proceedings. The twins exchanged glances that suggested they were still processing the idea of belonging somewhere again. Grace and Michael both showed signs of skeptical wariness, while Rebecca's expression remained carefully neutral. "First things first," Samuel continued, "I want everyone to understand that this house runs on cooperation, not commands. Mrs. Caldwell, you're the mother of this family, and I respect your authority over your children. I'm not trying to replace their father or override your decisions." Rebecca's posture relaxed slightly at this acknowledgement. "Thank you, Mr. Hartwell. That means more than you might realize." "Second," Samuel went on, "everyone in this household will contribute according to their abilities, but nobody will be worked beyond their strength or forced into tasks that frighten them. We're going to figure out together what needs doing and who's best suited for each job." He turned to Michael, who had been shifting restlessly throughout this speech. "Michael, I understand you have experience with carpentry." "Yes, sir," the 14-year-old replied, straightening with pride. "My father taught me before his accident. I can make cabinets, repair furniture, even do some basic house construction if you have the tools." "Excellent. I've been meaning to build additional shelving in the barn, and the chicken coop could use some reinforcement before winter. Would you be interested in taking charge of those projects?" Michael's face lit up with genuine enthusiasm. "I'd like that very much, sir. It's been months since I've had proper tools to work with." Samuel addressed the twins next. "Joseph and Joshua, I hear you're interested in the creek. That's good, because I need someone to check the beaver dams upstream and make sure they're not backing up water where it might flood during spring thaw. It's important work that requires people who know their way around water." The boys nodded eagerly, clearly delighted to be assigned a task that sounded more like adventure than labor. "Sarah," Samuel continued, noting how the girl had stopped crying and was listening intently, "I noticed you looking at the books last night. My wife Eleanor had quite a collection, and frankly, they've been gathering dust since she passed. Would you be willing to help me organize her library and maybe read some of the titles aloud in the evenings?" Eleanor always said books were meant to be shared. Sarah's entire face transformed with joy. "Oh yes, Mr. Hartwell, I love reading, and I promise I'll be very careful with the books. The one I damaged this morning was an accident. I was just trying to reach Little Women on the top shelf." "Little Women was one of Eleanor's favorites," Samuel said gently. "I'm sure she would have been happy to share it with you. As for the coffee mishap, these things happen. We'll see if the pages dry flat. Finally, he turned to Grace, who had been watching these exchanges with sharp attention. Grace, I get the impression you've been managing a lot of responsibilities for your family. I don't want to add to that burden, but I could use someone to help me understand the best way to run a household this size. Eleanor handled all of that, and I'm frankly lost without her guidance. Grace studied his face carefully, as if trying to determine whether this was genuine respect for her abilities or a polite way of assigning her traditional women's work. What exactly would that involve? Planning meals, managing supplies, coordinating everyone's schedules so we don't have 3 people trying to use the kitchen at the same time, Samuel replied. Basically helping me figure out how to make this arrangement work for everyone. And if I have suggestions that you disagree with? Grace asked pointedly. Samuel smiled, recognizing the intelligence behind her question. Then we'll discuss them, like reasonable people, and find a compromise. Grace, you've been looking after your family's welfare for months under impossible circumstances. I'd be a fool not to value your judgment. The transformation in Grace's demeanor was subtle, but unmistakable. Her shoulders dropped slightly, and some of the defensive tension left her face. I think I'd like that responsibility, she said quietly. What about me? Nathan piped up, having listened patiently to all the older children receiving their assignments. What's my job? Samuel looked down at the 5-year-old's earnest face and felt his heart squeeze. Nathan, your job is the most important of all. You're our official chicken inspector and egg collector. Those chickens need someone who pays attention to their moods and makes sure they're laying properly. Can you handle that kind of responsibility? Nathan nodded solemnly. I'm very good with chickens, Mr. Samuel. They like me because I talk to them nicely. That's exactly what they need, Samuel confirmed. And Mrs. Caldwell, I hope you'll feel free to organize household routines, however seems best to you. This is your home now, not just a place where you're staying. Rebecca had been quiet throughout the discussion, but Samuel could see her processing the implications of what he was offering. Mr. Hartwell, she said carefully, may I ask you something directly? Of course. How long do you expect this arrangement to continue? I need to know whether we're here temporarily while you figure out what to do with us, or whether you're genuinely offering us a permanent place. It was the question Samuel had been dreading because he didn't have a clear answer. The legal reality was that the Caldwell family would belong to him until they worked off their debt, but the moral reality was far more complex. He wanted to offer them permanent security, but he also didn't want to trap them in a situation they might eventually find constraining. Mrs. Caldwell, he said slowly, I bought your family because I couldn't bear the thought of you being separated or mistreated. But I didn't think through all the implications of that decision. Legally, you're bound to work for me until the debt is satisfied. Practically, you need a safe place to rebuild your lives. Personally, I find myself hoping you'll choose to stay, even after any legal obligations are fulfilled. He paused, looking around at all their faces. What I'm offering is this. We'll work together to make this household function as a real family would. Everyone contributes, everyone benefits, and everyone has a voice in decisions that affect them. When you've been here long enough to feel secure and explore your options, we'll discuss what comes next. If you choose to leave, I'll help you do so with resources and references. If you choose to stay, we'll figure out a formal arrangement that respects everyone's dignity. And if some of us want to stay and others want to leave? Grace asked, her voice carefully neutral. It was a perceptive question that highlighted one of the most difficult aspects of their situation. Samuel realized that treating them as a single unit, even with the best intentions, might not serve everyone's individual needs and desires. "Then we'll work out whatever arrangement best serves each person," Samuel replied. "Families adapt to changing circumstances all the time. There's no reason we can't do the same." Over the following days, the household began to establish rhythms that surprised Samuel with their naturalness. Michael threw himself into his carpentry projects with an enthusiasm that spoke of a young man grateful to exercise long-suppressed skills. The twins explored every inch of the property, cataloguing wildlife, mapping the creek's course, and returning each evening with detailed reports about beaver activity, fish populations, and the condition of various fences and outbuildings. Sarah appointed herself as Eleanor's literary guardian, carefully cleaning and organizing the book collection while reading selected passages aloud during evening gatherings. Her obvious love for stories and language reminded Samuel painfully of his wife, who had shared the same passion for the written word. Nathan approached his chicken duties with the solemnity of a professional inspector, spending hours in serious conversation with the birds and reporting their individual personalities and egg-laying performance to anyone who would listen. Samuel found himself looking forward to these daily briefings, which never failed to bring a smile to his face. Grace proved to be a natural household manager, quickly identifying inefficiencies in their routines and proposing solutions that made life easier for everyone. She had a gift for diplomatic negotiation when conflicts arose between siblings, and Samuel began to understand that she had been serving as a surrogate parent for her family long before their current crisis. Rebecca gradually emerged from the careful reserve she had maintained during their first days, revealing a dry sense of humor and practical intelligence that made her an invaluable partner in running the expanded household. She had opinions about everything from meal planning to livestock management, and Samuel found himself genuinely interested in her perspective on ranch operations. But it was the small, unexpected moments that convinced Samuel that his impulsive decision might actually work. Nathan falling asleep in Samuel's lap while Sarah read Alice in Wonderland aloud by the fireplace. Grace teaching him Eleanor's recipe for apple pie, both of them laughing when the first attempt collapsed into sweet, cinnamon-scented chaos. Michael proudly showing off his completed chicken coop repairs while the hens inspected his work with apparent approval. The twins discovering that Samuel knew dozens of stories about the mountain wildlife accumulated during years of solitary hunting and fishing expeditions. Rebecca humming while she worked in Eleanor's garden, coaxing late-season vegetables from plants that Samuel had been ready to abandon to the coming frost. These moments of genuine connection and shared purpose made Samuel realize that he wasn't just providing charity to a family in need, he was receiving something equally valuable in return. The house felt alive again in ways that had nothing to do with mere occupancy and everything to do with the presence of people who cared about each other and their shared environment. 3 weeks into their new life together, Samuel made a decision that would have seemed unthinkable during his months of solitary grief. He announced at dinner that he wanted to take the entire family to Silver Ridge for supplies, and to introduce them properly to the community as members of his household. "Are you certain that's wise?" Grace asked, her protective instincts immediately aroused. "Some of those people at the auction didn't look particularly friendly." "That's exactly why we need to go," Samuel replied. "If we're going to make this work long-term, people need to see that you're not prisoners or servants, but members of a family. The sooner we establish that, the better it will be for everyone." As they prepared for the trip to town, Samuel reflected on how much had changed since that day 3 weeks ago when he had acted on impulse and grief to purchase 7 strangers. They were no longer strangers, and his grief, while still present, had been joined by something he had thought lost forever: hope for the future. The legal documents that made him owner of the Caldwell family still rested in his desk drawer, But Samuel found himself thinking less about legal obligations and more about moral opportunities. Eleanor had challenged him to find a way to do good in the world, and for the first time since her death, he believed he might actually be succeeding. The first signs of trouble appeared on a crisp November morning, when Samuel discovered that someone had cut his fence lines during the night, allowing nearly 30 head of cattle to scatter across the neighboring valleys. The damage was too systematic to be accidental, too precise to be the work of wandering animals or natural wear. Someone had deliberately targeted his property with surgical malice. Standing in the early morning frost, examining the cleanly severed wire and methodically destroyed fence posts, Samuel felt a familiar knot of dread forming in his stomach. He'd been expecting retaliation ever since bringing the Caldwell family to town 3 weeks earlier, but the reality of it still hit like a punch to the chest. This wasn't random frontier violence or simple theft. This was a calculated message from people who wanted him to understand that his actions at the auction had consequences. "How bad is it?" Grace asked, approaching on horseback with Michael beside her. The 2 oldest Caldwell children had taken to riding the property boundaries each morning, a routine that had started as exploration but had evolved into something approaching security patrols. "Bad enough," Samuel replied grimly, gesturing toward the scattered cattle visible in the distance. "Professional work. Whoever did this knew exactly how to cause maximum inconvenience without technically breaking any laws serious enough to interest the territorial marshal." Michael dismounted and examined the cut wires with the practiced eye of someone who understood tools and their applications. "These weren't cut with standard wire cutters," he observed. "Look at the edges. They used heavy shears, probably the kind blacksmiths use for metalwork. And see how they pulled the posts out of the ground instead of just cutting the wire. They wanted to make sure we'd have to rebuild everything from scratch." Samuel nodded, impressed despite the circumstances by the boy's analytical skills. Michael's father had clearly taught him to think like a craftsman, to understand not just how things were built, but how they could be systematically destroyed. "We'll need to round up the cattle before they wander too far," Samuel said. "Grace, can you ride back and get Joshua and Joseph? We'll need all the help we can get." As Grace galloped back toward the house, Samuel found himself thinking about the timing of this attack. The vandalism had occurred just 2 days after their public appearance in Silver Ridge, where he'd made a point of introducing the Caldwell family as permanent members of his household. The message had been received loudly and clearly by certain members of the community, and this was their response. The trip to town had been illuminating in ways Samuel hadn't anticipated. While some residents had greeted the Caldwell family with genuine warmth and curiosity, others had made their displeasure known through cold stares, whispered conversations, and pointedly turned backs. Mrs. Patterson, the banker's wife, had been particularly vocal in her disapproval, loudly wondering why Samuel needed to import charity cases when there were perfectly respectable local families who could have used his help. But it was the reaction of Jeremiah Stone and Victor Hawthorne that had truly concerned Samuel. Both men had watched from across the street as he'd conducted business with the Caldwell children at his side, their faces showing the kind of calculating anger that suggested wounded pride and plans for revenge. Stone in particular had stared at Grace with an intensity that made Samuel's skin crawl, as if he were mentally cataloguing what he considered stolen property. Now, surveying the deliberate destruction of his property, Samuel realized that his decision to publicly claim the Caldwell family as his own had been interpreted as a direct challenge to the established order. In the minds of men like Stone and Hawthorne, he hadn't just outbid them at an auction, he'd undermined their authority and made them look weak in front of the entire community. The process of rounding up the scattered cattle took most of the day and required the participation of the entire household. Even Nathan contributed by riding with Samuel and calling out whenever he spotted cows hiding in brush or ravines. The work was exhausting and frustrating, made worse by the knowledge that it had been entirely unnecessary. As they drove a group of cattle back toward the rebuilt temporary fencing that Michael had hastily constructed, Samuel caught sight of riders approaching from the direction of town. 3 men on horseback, moving with the deliberate pace of people who wanted to be seen coming rather than arriving by surprise. "Grace," Samuel called out quietly, "take Nathan and Sarah back to the house. Now." The urgency in his tone was enough to send Grace spurring her horse toward the younger children without argument. Samuel watched her go, grateful for her quick understanding of the situation, then turned his attention to the approaching riders. As they drew closer, Samuel recognized 2 of the 3 men, Jeremiah Stone and a man named Wade Collins, who worked as Stone's foreman and had a reputation for solving problems with his fists rather than his words. The 3rd rider was a stranger, a lean man with the kind of weathered face and careful eyes that suggested either a lawman or a professional gunfighter. "Hartwell," Stone called out as they reined in about 20 feet away, close enough for conversation, but far enough to make a quick escape if necessary. "Heard you had some trouble with your fences last night. Shame about that." The false sympathy in Stone's voice made Samuel's jaw clench, but he kept his expression neutral. "News travels fast. In small communities," he replied evenly. "I don't suppose you happened to see anything suspicious while you were out riding?" Stone's smile was coldly amused. "Can't say that I did. But then again, a man who makes enemies shouldn't be surprised when bad things start happening to his property." The 3rd rider shifted in his saddle, and Samuel caught a glimpse of a badge, partially hidden beneath the man's coat, a territorial deputy, which meant this visit had an official component that made it far more dangerous than simple intimidation. "Mr. Hartwell," the badge-wearing stranger said, his voice carrying the neutral authority of someone accustomed to delivering uncomfortable news. "I'm Deputy Marshal William Garrett. I've received some complaints about your household arrangements that require investigation." Samuel felt his blood turn to ice. "What kind of complaints?" "The kind that suggest you might not be in compliance with territorial law regarding the treatment of indentured servants," Garrett replied. "There are allegations that you've been allowing your purchased workers to carry firearms, ride unescorted around the countryside, and generally behave in ways inconsistent with their legal status." The trap was elegant in its simplicity, Samuel realized. By treating the Caldwell family as equals rather than property, he had indeed violated the technical requirements of territorial labor law. Indentured servants were supposed to be supervised, restricted in their movements, and clearly differentiated from free citizens. His efforts to give them dignity and autonomy had inadvertently provided his enemies with legal ammunition. "I'm not aware of any laws requiring me to treat people inhumanely," Samuel said carefully. "Nobody's talking about inhumane treatment." Stone interjected with mock reasonableness. "We're talking about proper supervision and appropriate boundaries. When you parade those people around town like they're your social equals, it gives other indentured families dangerous ideas about their own situations." Deputy Garrett nodded, as if this made perfect sense. "The territorial government has a strong interest in maintaining social stability, Mr. Hartwell. When individual property owners start ignoring established protocols, it can lead to unrest and confusion among the laboring classes." Samuel understood the real message behind these carefully chosen words. His treatment of the Caldwell family was framed not as kindness, but as a threat to the entire system of debt bondage that kept desperate families trapped in cycles of servitude. By demonstrating that another way was possible, he had become dangerous to people whose prosperity depended on others' desperation. "What exactly are you proposing, Deputy?" Samuel asked. A formal inspection of your property and review of your household management practices, Garrett replied. If everything is found to be in order according to territorial guidelines, there won't be any problems. If not, well, corrective measures might be necessary. The threat was clear. Submit to official oversight that would force him to treat the Caldwell family as property, or face legal consequences that could result in their removal from his custody. When would this inspection take place? Samuel asked. Buying time to think. Tomorrow morning, Stone said with obvious satisfaction. No point in delaying official business. As the three men rode away, Samuel stood in his damaged pasture, feeling the weight of impossible choices settling on his shoulders. He could comply with the inspection and watch everything he'd built with the Caldwell family be systematically destroyed by legal requirements that reduced human beings to inventory. Or he could resist and risk losing them entirely to seizure by territorial authorities. That evening, Samuel called another family meeting around the kitchen table. This time, however, the atmosphere was heavy with tension rather than excited. Possibility. The day's events had reminded everyone that their carefully constructed new life existed at the sufferance of people who viewed it as a dangerous aberration. They're going to try to take us away, aren't they? Sarah asked, her voice small and frightened. The men who came today, they looked like the ones from the auction who wanted to buy us. Samuel wanted to offer reassurance, but he'd learned that this family had experienced enough false promises and broken dreams to deserve the truth. They're going to try, he admitted, but they haven't succeeded yet, and I don't intend to make it easy for them. What kind of inspection are they talking about? Grace asked. What will they be looking for? Samuel spread the territorial labor code on the table, a thick document he'd never bothered to read carefully before this crisis. As they went through the relevant sections together, the full scope of the challenge became clear. According to official guidelines, indentured servants were supposed to be housed separately from their owners, restricted to property boundaries without written permission, prohibited from carrying weapons or riding horses unescorted, and required to demonstrate visible markers of their status, such as distinctive clothing or identification badges. They want us to wear badges? Michael asked incredulously. Like we're livestock. That's exactly what they want, Rebecca said quietly. They want to make sure everyone can tell at a glance that we're not real people, just property walking. Around in human shape. The bitterness in her voice cut through Samuel like a knife. He realized that his attempts to provide dignity and normalcy had been in some ways crueler than honest acknowledgement of their legal reality. By giving them a taste of what family life could be, he had made the prospect of returning to servitude even more unbearable. There has to be something we can do, Grace said, her voice tight with determination. Some legal option we haven't considered. Samuel had been thinking about that very question all afternoon. There might be, he said slowly, but it would require taking risks that could make our situation worse instead of better. What kind of risks? Rebecca asked. Samuel pulled another document from his coat pocket, the original bill of sale that had made him legal owner of the Caldwell family. He'd been carrying it with him since the auction, unable to decide what to do with physical proof of something that felt morally reprehensible. I could destroy this, he said simply. Without the bill of sale, they can't prove I ever legally purchased your family. But that would also mean... That would mean we'd be fugitives, Grace finished, understanding the implications immediately. People without legal status or protection. It would mean we'd be free, Nathan said, with the confident logic of childhood. If the paper says we belong to Mr. Samuel, and Mr. Samuel burns the paper, then we don't belong to anybody but ourselves. The adults exchanged glances over the little boy's head, each recognizing both the simple truth and the dangerous naivety of his statement. Legal freedom without social recognition or economic security was hardly freedom at all, especially for a family with 6 children and winter approaching. There's another option, Michael said suddenly, his young face showing The kind of intense concentration that meant he was working through a complex problem. What if we make them prove their case instead of just accepting their authority? What do you mean? Samuel asked. I mean, what if we demand to see the specific legal basis for this inspection? What if we ask them to document exactly which laws we've supposedly broken and provide evidence of actual violations rather than just accusations? Grace looked at her younger brother with surprise and growing respect. That's actually not a bad idea. If they're going to use the law against us, we should at least make sure they're using it correctly. And if they can't provide adequate justification for their actions, Rebecca added, beginning to understand the strategy, we might be able to challenge their authority to interfere with our household. Samuel felt a spark of hope igniting in his chest. The Caldwell family's legal education was proving more extensive than he'd realized, and their strategic thinking was impressive for people who had been operating under crisis conditions for months. It's risky, he warned. If we challenge them directly and lose, the consequences could be severe. And if we don't challenge them, Grace replied, we lose everything anyway, just more slowly and politely. As they continued planning their response to tomorrow's inspection, Samuel marveled at the transformation that had occurred around his kitchen table. 3 weeks ago, these strangers had been bound to him by a legal transaction. Tonight, they were partners in resistance, united not by ownership, but by shared commitment to protecting something precious they had built together. The battle lines were drawn, and tomorrow would determine whether their experiment in the chosen family could survive the collision with a system designed to prevent exactly what they had accomplished. But for the first time since the fence cutting had announced the beginning of hostilities, Samuel felt ready for the fight. The morning of the inspection dawned grey and bitter, with snow clouds gathering over the mountain peaks like an advancing army. Samuel stood at his kitchen window, watching Deputy Marshal Garrett ride up the valley, accompanied not just by Stone and Collins, but by 6 additional men whose presence transformed what should have been a routine administrative visit into something approaching a military operation. Behind him, the Caldwell family moved through their morning routines with the careful precision of people preparing for battle. Grace had spent the pre-dawn hours coaching her younger siblings on how to respond to official questions, while Rebecca organized their few legal documents with the methodical attention of someone who understood that every piece of paper might prove crucial. Michael had stationed himself near the gun cabinet, ostensibly cleaning a rifle, but clearly ready for more serious action if circumstances demanded it. 8 men, Samuel announced quietly, not turning from the window. More than necessary for an inspection, fewer than you'd need for a real fight. They're trying to intimidate without provoking an incident that might attract unwanted attention from territorial authorities. Or they're planning something that requires witnesses, Grace replied, her voice steady despite the tension evident in her posture. Either way, we stick to the plan. The plan they had developed the previous evening was audacious in its simplicity. Instead of passively submitting to inspection, they would demand full legal documentation of the grounds for government interference with Samuel's household. If Garrett and his companions couldn't provide adequate justification under territorial law, the Caldwell family would assert their right to remain undisturbed. If they could provide such justification, then Samuel would be forced to make the choice he'd been dreading since the auction: comply with dehumanizing regulations or face the legal consequences of resistance. A sharp knock at the front door announced the arrival of the inspection party. Samuel took a deep breath, straightened his shoulders, and walked to answer it with the entire Caldwell family arranged behind him in a show of unity that was both touching and strategically calculated. Deputy Marshal Garrett stood on the porch, with his hat in his hands, maintaining the pretense of polite officialdom despite the small army arrayed behind him. Stone and Collins flanked him like hunting dogs barely restrained from attack, while the other men spread out across the yard in positions that effectively surrounded the house. "Mr. Hartwell," Garrett said with professional courtesy, "thank you for making yourself available for this proceeding. As I explained yesterday, we're here to conduct a routine compliance inspection regarding your management of indentured servants." "Before we begin," Samuel replied, "I'd like to see the specific legal authority under which you're conducting this inspection." Garrett's eyebrows rose slightly, suggesting he hadn't expected to encounter legal resistance. "I'm sorry? The territorial statute that grants you authority to inspect private households and evaluate treatment of lawfully contracted workers," Samuel clarified. "I assume you have documentation of this authority?" Stone stepped forward with obvious impatience. "What kind of game are you playing, Hartwell? The Deputy Marshal has full authority to investigate violations of territorial law." "I'm not questioning the Deputy Marshal's general authority," Samuel replied calmly. "I'm asking for a specific statutory citation for this particular type of inspection. Surely that's not an unreasonable request from a citizen who wants to understand his legal obligations." Garrett reached into his coat and withdrew a leather portfolio, consulting several documents before selecting one to show Samuel. Territorial Code Section 247 grants law enforcement officers authority to investigate complaints of improper treatment of contracted laborers. Samuel examined the document carefully, noting that Grace had moved close enough to read over his shoulder. The statute was genuinely authoritative, but its language was more limited than Garrett's description suggested. "This section refers to investigations of abuse, neglect, or willful endangerment," Samuel observed. "What specific allegations of abuse, neglect, or endangerment have been made against my household?" For the first time, Garrett appeared uncomfortable. "There have been reports of irregularities in your management practices." "What kind of irregularities?" Grace asked, stepping forward with the confidence of someone who had spent hours memorizing territorial labor law. "The statute you've cited requires specific allegations of harmful treatment, not general complaints about management style." Stone's face was beginning to redden with frustration. "Listen here, girl. You don't get to question the authority of—" "Actually," Michael interrupted, appearing at Grace's shoulder with a thick legal volume in his hands. "According to Territorial Code Section 15, any person subject to government investigation has the right to understand the specific legal basis for that investigation." Samuel stared at the 14-year-old in amazement. Where had Michael found a copy of the Territorial Code, and when had he become sufficiently familiar with it to cite specific sections from memory? Garrett looked increasingly uncomfortable as he realized that his simple intimidation visit had evolved into a complex legal proceeding. "Mr. Hartwell, these questions are unusual. Most citizens are content to cooperate with official investigations without demanding extensive documentation." "Most citizens," Rebecca said quietly, joining the group on the porch, "don't have as much at stake as we do. Deputy Marshal, with respect, you're asking us to submit to an investigation that could result in the separation of our family. Surely you can understand why we'd want to ensure that such a serious step is taken only on solid legal grounds." The transformation in Rebecca's demeanor was striking. Gone was the careful deference she had shown during their early weeks together, replaced by the quiet authority of a woman defending her children with every tool at her disposal. Garrett consulted his documents again, clearly searching for language that would support his position. "There have been allegations that Mr. Hartwell has failed to maintain proper supervision of his contracted workers, allowing them to carry weapons and move freely around the territory without appropriate oversight." "And who made these allegations?" Samuel asked, The complaints were filed by concerned citizens who observed violations of established protocols, Garrett replied evasively. Citizens like Mr. Stone? Grace asked pointedly, glancing toward the rancher who was making no effort to hide his involvement. In the proceedings, the identity of the complainants is not relevant to the investigation, Garrett said firmly. Actually, Michael said, consulting his legal volume again, Section 247 requires that allegations of abuse or neglect be made under oath by witnesses with direct knowledge of the alleged violations. Anonymous complaints aren't sufficient grounds for official investigation. Samuel felt a surge of pride, watching the Caldwell children systematically dismantle the legal foundation of the inspection. Months of hardship and uncertainty had forged them into formidable advocates for their own interests, and their quick intelligence was proving more than a match for Garrett's bureaucratic authority. Furthermore, Grace added, the statute specifies that investigations must focus on treatment that threatens the health, safety, or welfare of contracted workers. Allowing us to carry weapons and move freely actually enhances our safety rather than endangering it. Stone had heard enough. This is ridiculous, he exploded. These people are property, not lawyers. You can't let them dictate the terms of an official investigation. The word property hung in the air like a slap, instantly transforming the atmosphere on the porch. Samuel saw Nathan's face crumple with confusion and hurt, while the older children's expressions hardened with the kind of cold anger that comes from having one's fundamental humanity denied. Mr. Stone, Samuel said quietly, his voice carrying a dangerous undertone that made several of the assembled men shift nervously, I would advise you to choose your words more carefully when discussing members of my family. Your family? Stone sneered. They're contracted laborers, Hartwell. The papers say you own them, not that you adopted them. Samuel reached into his coat and withdrew the bill of sale that had been weighing on his conscience since the auction. For a moment, he held the document in his hands, feeling its power to define and constrain the lives of 7 innocent people. Then, with deliberate ceremony, he tore it in half. The sound of ripping paper seemed to echo across the yard like a gunshot. Garrett's mouth fell open in shock, while Stone turned purple with rage. Behind Samuel, he heard little Nathan gasp with delight and Sarah whisper, "He did it," in amazed tones. "There," Samuel said calmly, letting the pieces of paper flutter. "To the porch floor. Problem solved. Since I no longer possess any legal claim to ownership of these people, there's no basis for investigating my treatment of contracted laborers." "You can't do that," Stone shouted. "That's destruction of legal documents. That's a man exercising his property rights," Rebecca interrupted with quiet satisfaction. "If Mr. Hartwell owned our labor contracts, then he had the legal right to terminate those contracts at his discretion." Garrett stared at the torn paper as if trying to will it back together through sheer concentration. "Mr. Hartwell, this action may have serious legal consequences. Without proper documentation of debt satisfaction, these people's status becomes ambiguous." "Their status is quite clear," Samuel replied. "They are free citizens of the United States and the Montana Territory, residing voluntarily on my property as my invited guests." "Invited guests don't work to pay off debts," Colin said suspiciously. "No," Grace said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Invited guests work because they choose to contribute to a household they consider their home." The distinction was subtle but legally significant. As long as the Caldwell family's labor was voluntary rather than compelled, no territorial statute governed their living arrangements or working conditions. By destroying the contract that bound them to him, Samuel had paradoxically freed them to remain with him on terms of their own choosing. "This is preposterous," Stone sputtered. "You can't just declare people free because you feel like it." "Actually," Michael said, consulting his legal volume one final time, The 13th Amendment to the Constitution prohibits involuntary servitude except as punishment for crime. If these people are working voluntarily, then no government authority can compel them to leave or change their working conditions. Samuel marveled at the teenager's legal acumen. Somehow, in the space of a single evening, Michael had managed to identify the constitutional principle that made their resistance not just morally justified, but legally unassailable. Deputy Marshal Garrett closed his portfolio with obvious frustration. "Mr. Hartwell, while your actions may be technically legal, they represent a dangerous precedent that could undermine the entire system of debt collection in this territory." "Good," Samuel replied without hesitation. "Any system that treats human beings as property deserves to be undermined." The confrontation might have escalated further, but it was interrupted by the sound of additional horses approaching the ranch. Samuel turned to see a group of riders cresting the hill behind his house, but these weren't more of Stone's allies. These were neighbors and townspeople, including Dr. Morrison from Silver Ridge, the Methodist minister Reverend Clark, and surprisingly, Robert Patterson, the banker. "What's all this commotion about?" Dr. Morrison called out as he dismounted near the porch. "We heard there was some kind of official business taking place out here." Garrett seemed taken aback by the arrival of additional witnesses. "This is a private matter between Mr. Hartwell and territorial authorities. Nothing private about it when you bring 8 armed men to a family's home," Reverend Clark observed mildly. "Makes a person wonder what kind of official business requires such a show of force." Samuel realized that word of the inspection had spread through Silver Ridge and that not everyone in the community supported Stone's efforts to destroy his arrangement with the Caldwell family. The presence of respected citizens like Dr. Morrison and Reverend Clark provided a level of protection that even Garrett couldn't ignore. "The matter appears to be resolved," Garrett announced, clearly eager to extricate himself from a situation that had grown beyond his control. "Mr. Hartwell has clarified the legal status of his household members by freeing us," Nathan announced proudly to the assembled crowd. "Mr. Samuel tore up the papers and made us free." The simplicity of the child's explanation seemed to capture the essence of what had occurred better than any legal argument. Samuel saw several of the townspeople smile, while others nodded approvingly at his decision to prioritize human dignity over legal technicalities. As Garrett and his men prepared to leave, Stone made one final attempt to salvage his position. "This isn't over, Hartwell," he snarled. "You may have gotten away with this today, but there are other ways to deal with troublemakers." "Mr. Stone," Dr. Morrison said, in the authoritative tone of someone accustomed to being obeyed, "I believe you've said quite enough for one day." The public rebuke from one of Silver Ridge's most respected citizens seemed to deflate Stone's remaining bluster. He mounted his horse and rode away with his companions, leaving Samuel and the Caldwell family surrounded by neighbors who had come to witness their stand for freedom. As the crowd began to disperse, Samuel realized that something fundamental had changed during the morning's confrontation. The Caldwell family was no longer his responsibility or his property. They were his partners in creating something new and precious that neither law nor custom had been able to destroy. The gray clouds that had threatened snow all morning finally opened, sending fat flakes drifting down over the mountain valley like a benediction. Samuel stood on his porch, watching his chosen family celebrate their freedom, and felt Eleanor's presence beside him as surely as if she had never left. They had won this battle, but Samuel knew the war for their right to exist as a family was far from over. Stone and men like him would not simply accept defeat, and there would be other challenges ahead. But for the first time since Eleanor's death, Samuel felt truly hopeful about the future. The torn pieces of the bill of sale lay scattered at his feet, transformed from instruments of bondage into symbols of liberation. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight they would celebrate the victory of love over law, of humanity over property, of chosen family over enforced servitude. In the weeks following the confrontation with Deputy Marshal Garrett, Silver Ridge found itself quietly divided into two camps that rarely acknowledged their existence but never stopped measuring each other's strength. The story of Samuel Hartwell tearing up legal documents to free the Caldwell family had spread through the mountain territory like wildfire, inspiring some residents while horrifying others who saw it as a dangerous precedent that threatened the very foundations of their frontier society. Dr. Morrison had become an unexpected champion of the Hartwell household, using his considerable influence to advocate for what he called progressive approaches to community welfare. During his weekly rounds treating patients throughout the valley, he made a point of sharing stories about the Caldwell children's contributions to local life. Michael's expert carpentry work on the church bell tower, Sarah's assistance teaching younger children to read, the twins' detailed wildlife surveys that helped ranchers protect their livestock from predator threats. Civilization advances, Dr. Morrison declared during a heated town council meeting in late November, when we choose compassion over convention, when we elevate human dignity above legal technicalities. The Hartwell family represents the best of what our community can become. But for every voice supporting Samuel's actions, there seemed to be another, condemning them as reckless idealism that would ultimately endanger everyone in the territory. Mrs. Patterson led a vocal faction of townspeople who argued that Samuel's defiance of established labor laws would encourage dangerous unrest among other indentured families, potentially leading to widespread chaos and economic collapse. "Mark my words," she proclaimed loudly enough to be heard throughout Henderson's general store, "this foolishness will bring nothing but trouble. When every debtor family in Colorado Territory decides they can simply walk away from their obligations, who's going to honor contracts? Who's going to maintain order?" The philosophical divide manifested in practical ways that affected every aspect of life in Silver Ridge. Some merchants offered discounted prices when the Caldwell children accompanied Samuel to town, viewing their integration into the community as a positive development worthy of encouragement. Others pointedly refused to serve them at all, or demanded payment in advance with the suspicious attitude of people dealing with potential thieves. The most significant change, however, came from an entirely unexpected source. Other families, trapped in cycles of debt bondage, began seeking Samuel's advice about their own situations. Word had spread throughout the region that a man in Silver Ridge had found a way to break the legal chains that bound desperate people to their creditors, and hope was drawing the desperate like moths to flame. The first to arrive was Margaret Stevens, a widow with 3 young children whose husband had died in a mining accident 6 months earlier. She appeared at Samuel's door on a bitterly cold December morning, leading a mule carrying everything her family owned and clutching a stack of papers that documented their crushing obligations to the mining company. "Mr. Hartwell," she said through chattering teeth, "I heard that you might know something about getting free from debt contracts. My children and I are supposed to be sold next week to cover what my husband owed, and I was hoping—" She trailed off, clearly uncertain how to ask for help that might require risking her family's safety. Samuel invited her inside immediately, and within minutes the Caldwell family had mobilized to provide hot food, warm clothes, and a safe place for the Stevens children to rest while the adults discussed options. "The problem," Samuel explained, after reviewing Margaret's documents, "is that your husband's debt was secured by a different type of contract than what bound the Caldwell family. Mining company obligations often include provisions that make them much harder to challenge legally." Michael looked up from the papers he'd been studying with intense concentration. But not impossible, he said thoughtfully. Mr. Samuel, what if we approach this differently? Instead of trying to break the contract, what if we found a way to satisfy it through alternative means? The suggestion sparked a strategy session that continued late into the evening and ultimately involved not just the two families, but also Dr. Morrison, Reverend Clark, and several other community members who had quietly been developing their own network of resistance to exploitative labor practices. The mining company wants compensation for the debt, Dr. Morrison observed. They don't necessarily care whether that compensation comes from forced labor or from other sources. If we could raise enough money to pay off Mrs. Stevens's obligations, directly a community fund, Reverend Clark suggested. Contributions from citizens who believe in helping neighbors rather than exploiting their misfortunes. The idea seemed impossibly optimistic until Sarah made a simple observation that changed everything. We don't need to raise the full amount all at once. We just need to raise enough to make an offer that's better than what they'd get from selling Mrs. Stevens at auction. The mathematical reality was sobering, but not insurmountable. Margaret Stevens owed the mining company $180, but her family would likely sell for no more than $60 at auction after expenses and the auctioneer's commission. An immediate cash payment of $75 would represent a significant profit for the company, while costing the community far less than the debt's face value. Within a week, the informal network organized by Dr. Morrison and Reverend Clark had raised the necessary funds through a combination of direct donations, goods and services donated for resale, and small loans from sympathetic citizens. Margaret Stevens' debt was satisfied, and her family was free to rebuild their lives without the specter of separation hanging over them. But the success of this first rescue operation created as many problems as it solved. Word spread quickly that Silver Ridge had become a destination for families seeking alternatives to debt bondage, and soon Samuel found himself hosting a steady stream of desperate people who had traveled hundreds of miles based on rumors of a place where freedom might be possible. Some cases proved manageable through community fundraising or legal advocacy. Others involved complications that tested everyone's commitment to their principles. When the Harrison family arrived with debts exceeding $400 and a sick infant who required expensive medical care, even Dr. Morrison admitted that the community's resources were being stretched beyond sustainable limits. "We can't save everyone," he said during a private conversation with Samuel. "As much as we might want to, we simply don't have the financial capacity to buy freedom for every indebted family in the Colorado Territory." Samuel understood the practical constraints, but he also recognized that their rescue efforts had created moral obligations that couldn't be easily dismissed. Families like the Harrisons had sold everything they owned and traveled for weeks to reach Silver Ridge based on stories of hope and liberation. Turning them away seemed like a betrayal of everything they had accomplished. The solution, when it came, emerged from Grace's increasingly sophisticated understanding of territorial law and her growing network of correspondence with similar communities. Throughout the Mountain West, through letters exchanged with other families who had escaped debt bondage, she had learned about a legal strategy that might address their resource limitations while expanding their impact. What if we stopped thinking about this as charity and started thinking about it as business? She proposed during a strategy meeting that had become a weekly tradition in Samuel's living room. Instead of trying to buy freedom for families, what if we helped them buy freedom for themselves? The concept was elegant in its simplicity. Rather than raising funds to pay off debts directly, the Silver Ridge Network would provide small loans and business opportunities that enabled indebted families to generate their own income for debt satisfaction. A family with useful skills could be provided with tools, materials, and guaranteed customers for their products. Those with agricultural knowledge could be given access to land and seed money for crop production. "It's not charity," Grace explained. To the assembled group, it's an investment in human potential, and investment creates returns that make the program self-sustaining rather than depleting community resources. Michael had been working on detailed financial projections for Grace's proposal, and his calculations suggested that such a program could theoretically help 10 times as many families using the same initial investment that direct debt purchase required for a single family. "The key," he said, presenting his figures with the confidence of someone who had discovered a genuine passion for mathematical problem-solving, "is matching families with economic opportunities that build on their existing skills and interests. A carpenter doesn't need us to buy his freedom. He needs tools and contracts. A seamstress needs fabric and customers, not cash payments to her creditors." The transformation of their rescue efforts from emergency charity to systematic economic development attracted attention from unexpected quarters. Robert Patterson, the banker who had initially been skeptical of Samuel's actions, began quietly referring potential borrowers to the Silver Ridge Network when they needed smaller loans, or more flexible terms than his institution could provide. "I'm not saying I approve of everything you people are doing," he told Samuel during a private meeting at the bank, "but I can't argue with the results. The families you've helped are meeting their obligations, contributing to the local economy, and building stable lives for their children. That's more than I can say for some of our conventional lending arrangements." Even more surprising was the gradual shift in attitude among some of Silver Ridge's more conservative residents. Mrs. Patterson remained vocally opposed to what she called dangerous social experimentation, but her husband had begun expressing cautious interest in the economic development aspects of the program. "If these people are paying their debts and supporting local businesses," he observed during a town council meeting, "then perhaps we should focus on the practical benefits rather than theoretical concerns about social disruption." The success of individual families also helped change perceptions about the feasibility of alternatives to debt bondage. When the Stevens family opened a successful bakery that quickly became one of Silver Ridge's most popular businesses, skeptics found it harder to argue that former indentured servants couldn't function as productive community members. Margaret Stevens herself became one of the most effective advocates for continued expansion of the rescue network. Her testimony about the transformation in her children's lives carried weight with parents who might otherwise have been resistant to social change. "6 months ago, my daughter Lucy was facing the possibility of being sold to strangers who might have worked her to death before she reached adulthood," Margaret told a gathering at Reverend Clark's church. "Today, she's learning to read and write, helping me run our bakery, and planning to become a teacher someday. That's the difference between despair and hope, between slavery and freedom." But the network's growing success also attracted increased hostility from those whose profits depended on maintaining the existing system of debt bondage. Stone and his allies had not abandoned their opposition to Samuel's activities. They had simply shifted tactics from direct confrontation to more subtle forms of sabotage and intimidation. Reports began reaching Silver Ridge of mysterious problems, affecting families who had been helped by the rescue network. The Harrison family's small farm suffered a suspicious fire that destroyed their entire crop just before harvest. The Stevens bakery experienced a series of break-ins that resulted in the theft of flour, sugar, and other expensive ingredients. Most troubling were incidents involving children from rescued families. Sarah Caldwell was followed home from town by unknown men who made no attempt to approach her, but whose presence was clearly intended as intimidation. The Harrison children found Their school supplies repeatedly destroyed or stolen, forcing them to miss classes until replacements could be obtained. "They're trying to make an example," Grace observed during one of their strategy meetings. "Show other families that freedom comes with a price that might be too dangerous to pay." Samuel felt the familiar weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders as he contemplated the unintended consequences of their success. By creating alternatives to debt bondage, they had inevitably made enemies of those who profited from such arrangements. The question now was whether their growing network of allies would prove strong enough to protect the vulnerable families they were trying to help. The answer would come sooner than anyone expected, in the form of a crisis that would test every alliance they had built and every principle they claimed to defend. But as Samuel looked around his living room at the faces of people who had become not just neighbors, but partners in creating a more just society, he felt confident that they had built something worth defending. The revolution they had started, with a single impulsive bid at an auction, had grown into something larger and more powerful than any of them had imagined. Now they would discover whether it was strong enough to survive the backlash from those who preferred the old ways of power and exploitation. The final test of everything Samuel and the Caldwell family had built came on a frozen February morning, when little Nathan burst through the kitchen door, his face streaked with tears and his words tumbling over each other in panic. "They took them," he sobbed, throwing himself into Rebecca's arms. "The bad men came with guns, and they took Margaret and her children. They said anybody who helps freed slaves is breaking the law." The blood drained from Samuel's face as he processed Nathan's words. Margaret Stevens and her 3 children had been seized by what appeared to be an official law enforcement action, though the legal basis for such seizure remained unclear. After 6 months of operating their successful bakery as free citizens, the Stevens family had seemed secure from further persecution. Grace immediately began organizing a response with the methodical efficiency that had made her indispensable to their rescue network. "Michael, ride to Dr. Morrison's house and tell him what's happened. Sarah, take Nathan upstairs and help him calm down while you write down everything he saw. Joshua and Joseph, I need you to ride to the Stevens bakery and see what evidence you can gather about who took them and where they might have gone." Within minutes, the Caldwell children had dispersed on their various missions, leaving Samuel and Rebecca to contemplate the implications of this brazen attack on their network. If established families like the Stevens could be seized without warning or apparent legal justification, then every family they had helped was potentially vulnerable to similar raids. "This is Stone's work," Rebecca said quietly, her voice tight with controlled fury. "He's found a way to use official authority to destroy what we've built, one family at a time." Samuel nodded grimly. The pattern was becoming clear. Their enemies had concluded that direct confrontation was less effective than systematic persecution designed to discourage other families from seeking help or communities from providing it. By making the consequences of freedom appear more dangerous than the certainty of bondage, Stone and his allies hoped to strangle the rescue network in its cradle. Dr. Morrison arrived within the hour, his usually composed demeanor shaken by the news of the kidnapping. "I've already sent word to the Territorial Marshal's office," he announced, "but I'm not optimistic about getting official help. The men who took the Stevens family were carrying what appeared to be legitimate warrants, though nobody was allowed to examine them closely." "Warrants for what?" Grace asked, having returned from organizing search parties. "Outstanding debts from Margaret's late husband's mining obligations," Dr. Morrison replied. "Apparently, someone discovered additional contracts that weren't included in our original debt settlement. The total obligation has mysteriously grown from $180 to more than $600. The fraudulent nature of these additional claims was obvious to everyone in the room, but proving fraud would require legal proceedings that could take months, while the Stephen's family suffered under whatever conditions their captors had arranged. More immediately, the successful seizure would encourage similar actions against other rescued families. "We need to get them back," Michael said, with the quiet determination that had become his trademark. "Not through lawyers or official channels, but directly, today, before Stone has time to consolidate his position." Samuel stared at the 14-year-old in amazement. "Michael, what exactly are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting that if they used fake legal documents to steal the Stevens family, then we use real legal documents to get them back," Michael replied. "Grace and I have been working on something that might solve this problem permanently." Grace produced a leather portfolio from her satchel, withdrawing several official-looking documents that she spread across the kitchen table. Samuel examined them with growing astonishment, recognizing territorial forms and legal seals, but struggling to understand their significance. "What am I looking at?" he asked. "Incorporation papers for the Silver Ridge Cooperative Development Association," Grace explained. "A territorial business entity authorized to provide loans, employment opportunities, and economic development services throughout the Colorado Territory." Samuel felt his jaw drop. "You've incorporated our rescue network as an official business." "More than that," Michael added with obvious pride. "We've obtained territorial licensing as a labor contracting agency, which means we have legal authority to negotiate employment agreements, provide worker protection services, and, if necessary, challenge improper seizures of contracted laborers." The implications were staggering. By transforming their informal rescue efforts into a legally recognized business entity, Grace and Michael had created a framework that could provide official protection for rescued families while generating sustainable revenue to fund continued operations. "How did you manage all this without anyone knowing?" Dr. Morrison asked, clearly impressed by the sophistication of their legal maneuvering. "Sarah helped with the correspondence," Grace replied. "She's been writing letters to territorial authorities for months, gathering information about business licensing requirements and legal protections for cooperative enterprises." And Michael figured out the financial structures that make everything work. "The key insight," Michael explained, "was realizing that territorial law actually favors business entities over individual citizens when it comes to labor disputes. A private citizen who frees indentured servants might be seen as undermining social order, but a licensed labor contractor who negotiates better working conditions is just conducting legitimate business." Samuel shook his head in wonder at the strategic thinking these children had developed. They had not only identified the legal vulnerabilities that made their rescue network susceptible to attack, but had also created institutional protections that could safeguard their work for years to come. "So, how does this help us get the Stevens family back?" Rebecca asked. "Because," Grace said with a smile that suggested she had been looking forward to this moment, "the Silver Ridge Cooperative Development Association has just filed an official complaint with the territorial marshal, alleging unlawful seizure of contracted workers by unauthorized persons using fraudulent documentation." She handed Samuel another document, this one bearing official seals and signatures that made it look far more authoritative than anything Stone or his allies could produce. "We've also requested immediate investigation of all debt claims against the Stevens family, along with suspension of any enforcement actions until the investigation is complete." Dr. Morrison whistled softly. "This is brilliant. You've turned their own bureaucratic weapons against them." "More than that," Michael added, "we've established legal precedent that could protect every family we've helped. Once we're officially recognized as a legitimate labor contracting agency, any attempt to seize our workers becomes a federal offense that brings in territorial marshals rather than local deputies." The transformation from desperate improvisation to systematic legal strategy represented a quantum leap in their capabilities. But Samuel understood that paperwork alone wouldn't be sufficient to rescue the Stevens family. Stone and his allies had demonstrated their willingness to ignore legal niceties when it served their purposes, and official complaints might take weeks to produce results. "Where are they being held?" Samuel asked. "According to witnesses, they were taken to Stone's ranch," Dr. Morrison replied, "supposedly to work off their debts under direct supervision." Samuel felt his anger crystallizing into cold determination. Stone's ranch was a fortress-like compound 20 miles from Silver Ridge, isolated enough to make rescue difficult, but not impossible for people who knew the territory and were willing to take calculated risks. "We're going to need help," he said quietly. "More help than our usual network can provide." The help came from an unexpected source. Other families throughout the territory who had been quietly following the Silver Ridge rescue efforts and hoping for similar opportunities in their own communities. Word of the Stevens kidnapping had spread quickly through informal networks of communication, and the response was both immediate and overwhelming. By evening, Samuel's ranch had become an impromptu headquarters for nearly 50 people representing communities throughout the Colorado Territory. Some had traveled hundreds of miles based on nothing more than rumors that someone was finally taking action against the system of debt bondage that had trapped their neighbors and relatives. Among the arrivals were several men whose presence transformed the gathering from a planning meeting into something approaching a military operation. Thomas Mitchell, a former cavalry officer who had settled near Denver after leaving the Army, brought both tactical expertise and a grim determination to see justice done. James Crawford, a territorial judge who had become disgusted with the legal system's tolerance for exploitation, offered to provide official sanction for whatever action they decided to take. "Gentlemen," Judge Crawford announced to the assembled group, "what we're dealing with here isn't just kidnapping, it's a systematic conspiracy to subvert territorial law for private gain. I'm prepared to issue warrants for the arrest of everyone involved in this illegal seizure, but I'll need evidence and witnesses to make those warrants stick." The evidence came from an unexpected source. One of Stone's own employees, a young cowhand named Billy Martinez, who had become disgusted with his employer's increasingly criminal behavior. Billy had ridden hard from Stone's ranch to Silver Ridge with detailed information about the Stevens family's location and the security arrangements protecting their captors. They're being held in the old bunkhouse behind the main ranch buildings. Billy reported to the strategy session that had reconvened in Samuel's living room. "Stone's got 6 men guarding them, but most of those men aren't comfortable with what they're doing. They signed on to work cattle, not to guard kidnapped families." "What about the legal documents Stone claims justify the seizure?" Grace asked. Billy's expression darkened with disgust. "They're forgeries, and not very good ones. Stone had them made by a clerk in Denver who specializes in creating false documentation for debt collectors. I've seen the originals. They're written on paper that's supposed to be 5 years old, but has ink that's clearly fresh." The revelation that Stone's entire operation was based on fraudulent documents simplified their tactical situation considerably. Instead of having to prove that legitimate debts were being collected improperly, they could focus on exposing criminal conspiracy and kidnapping. Judge Crawford prepared official warrants for the arrest of Stone and his accomplices, while Thomas Mitchell organized the rescue operation with military precision. Samuel found himself assigned to lead one of 3 groups that would approach Stone's ranch from different directions, creating confusion and preventing escape while minimizing the risk of violence. "Remember," Mitchell emphasized during the final briefing, "we're not vigilantes seeking revenge. We're law enforcement officers executing legitimate warrants. Our goal is to rescue the Stevens family and arrest the perpetrators with minimum risk to everyone involved." The rescue operation launched before dawn on a bitter February morning, with nearly 30 men converging on Stone's ranch through the Pre-dawn darkness. Samuel rode with Grace and Michael, both of whom had insisted on participating despite the obvious dangers. "This is our network," Grace had argued when Samuel tried to convince her to stay behind. "Our friends who are in danger. We're not going to hide at home while other people take the risks." The approach to Stone's ranch revealed that Billy Martinez's intelligence had been accurate. The main buildings were lightly guarded, with most of Stone's men apparently confident that their isolated location provided sufficient security. The old bunkhouse, where the Stevens family was being held, stood about 100 yards behind the main house, connected by a well-worn path that would provide easy access for rescuers. Samuel's group reached their position just as the eastern sky began to lighten with the first hints of dawn. Through binoculars borrowed from Thomas Mitchell, he could see movement inside the bunkhouse and what appeared to be guards stationed at the front and rear entrances. The coordinated assault began with Judge Crawford riding up to the main house and loudly announcing that he was there to execute territorial warrants for the arrest of Jeremiah Stone and his accomplices. The announcement created exactly the confusion Mitchell had hoped for, drawing guards away from the bunkhouse to investigate what appeared to be an official law enforcement action. Samuel's group moved quickly through the resulting chaos, reaching the bunkhouse just as Stone himself emerged from the main house to confront Judge Crawford. Grace and Michael took positions to watch for approaching guards, while Samuel approached the building where the Stevens family was being held. "Margaret," he called softly through the wooden walls. "It's Samuel Hartwell. We're here to take you home." The response was immediate and heartfelt. The sound of Margaret Stevens crying with relief and her children's excited voices asking if they were really going to be rescued. Within minutes, Samuel had broken the simple lock that secured the bunkhouse door and was helping the Stevens family gather their few possessions for the journey home. The confrontation at the main house had escalated into a full-scale legal proceeding, with Judge Crawford formally arresting Stone and several of his accomplices, while Thomas Mitchell's men secured the ranch buildings and gathered evidence of the criminal conspiracy. Stone's protests about his legal authority to collect debts were systematically dismantled by the production of the forged documents Billy Martinez had described. "Mr. Stone," Judge Crawford announced with obvious satisfaction, "you are under arrest for kidnapping, fraud, conspiracy, and violation of territorial labor protection statutes. Your companions are similarly charged, and I suspect will find additional violations as we investigate your operations more thoroughly." The journey back to Silver Ridge became a victory procession, with the rescued Stevens family surrounded by dozens of supporters who had risked their safety to strike a blow against the system of debt bondage. Margaret Stevens rode beside Samuel, tears streaming down her face as she contemplated how close her family had come to disappearing forever into Stone's web of exploitation. "How can we ever thank you?" she asked as Silver Ridge came into view in the distance. "By continuing to build the life you've earned," Samuel replied, "by showing other families that freedom is possible and worth fighting for." But the day's victories extended far beyond the rescue of a single family. Word of the successful operation spread quickly throughout the territory, inspiring similar efforts in other communities, while demonstrating that the seemingly invincible system of debt bondage could be challenged and defeated by organized resistance. Within months, the Silver Ridge Cooperative Development Association had expanded into a territorial network with branches in 12 communities, providing legal protection and economic opportunities for hundreds of families who had previously been trapped in cycles of poverty and exploitation. Grace and Michael had become recognized experts in cooperative business development, consulted by territorial authorities who were beginning to understand that economic justice was essential for long-term social stability. Samuel found himself appointed to a territorial commission on labor reform, using his unique perspective as someone who had witnessed both the human cost of debt bondage and the practical benefits of alternative approaches. His testimony before territorial legislators helped establish new legal protections that made it much harder for unscrupulous creditors to exploit desperate families. But perhaps the most meaningful transformation was the one that occurred within Samuel's own household. The Caldwell family had evolved from refugees seeking shelter into partners in creating systemic change, each member contributing unique skills and perspectives that made their collective efforts more effective than any individual could have achieved alone. Nathan, now 6 years old, had become the unofficial mascot of rescue operations, his innocent enthusiasm helping traumatized families feel welcomed and safe in their new circumstances. The twins had developed into expert scouts and messengers, their detailed knowledge of territorial geography proving invaluable for coordinating activities across vast distances. Sarah had emerged as a gifted teacher and communicator, helping rescued families develop the literacy and numeracy skills they needed to manage their own economic affairs. Michael's business acumen had attracted attention from territorial investors who were beginning to understand that supporting cooperative enterprises could be both profitable and socially beneficial. Grace had become the acknowledged leader of the territorial network, her strategic thinking and legal expertise making her a formidable advocate for families who had previously had no voice in the systems that controlled their lives. At 19, she was already being mentioned as a potential candidate for territorial legislative office. Rebecca had found her calling as a counselor and organizer, helping traumatized families heal from their experiences while building the emotional resilience necessary for independent living. Her quiet strength and practical wisdom had made her a trusted advisor to dozens of families throughout the territory. And Samuel himself had discovered that Eleanor's challenge to do good in the world had led him not just to personal redemption, but to a life purpose that gave meaning to his grief while honoring her memory in ways he had never imagined possible. On a warm spring evening, 2 years after the auction that had started everything, Samuel stood on his porch, watching the Caldwell. Children play in the yard while Rebecca tended Eleanor's flower garden, which had burst into spectacular bloom under her careful attention. The house was filled with the sounds of family life, but it was also filled with the satisfaction of work that mattered, of battles won and lives transformed. Dr. Morrison rode up the path toward the house, carrying news of the latest territorial legislative session where several of their reform proposals had been adopted into law. The systematic changes they had advocated were becoming institutional reality, ensuring that future families would have protections and opportunities that had been unimaginable just a few years earlier. "You know," Dr. Morrison said as he dismounted and joined Samuel on the porch, "when you made that impulsive bid at the auction, I thought you might have lost your mind. I never imagined you were starting a revolution." Samuel smiled, thinking of Eleanor and the promise he had made to find a way to do good in the world. "Sometimes," he replied, "the most important decisions are the ones we make with our hearts instead of our heads. Sometimes the most reckless acts of compassion turn out to be the most practical investments in the future we want to create." As the sun set behind the Rocky Mountain peaks, painting the sky in the brilliant colors that Eleanor had loved so much, Samuel felt the deep satisfaction of a promise kept and a life well lived. The auction that had started as an ending had become a beginning, and the family that had begun with a legal transaction had evolved into something far more precious, a chosen bond that no law could create and no force could destroy. The revolution they had started with a single act of conscience had grown into a movement that would transform the Colorado Territory for generations to come. And at its heart was the simple truth that Samuel had learned from Eleanor and passed on to the Caldwell family. That every person deserves dignity, that every family deserves security, and that love multiplied through service becomes a force, powerful enough to change the world. The final test of everything Samuel and the Caldwell family had built came on a frozen February morning, when little Nathan burst through the kitchen door, his face streaked with tears and his words tumbling over each other in panic. "They took them," he sobbed, throwing himself into Rebecca's arms. "The bad men came with guns, and they took Margaret and her children. They said anybody who helps freed slaves is breaking the law." The blood drained from Samuel's face as he processed Nathan's words. Margaret Stevens and her 3 children had been seized by what appeared to be an official law enforcement action, though the legal basis for such seizure remained unclear. After 6 months of operating their successful bakery as free citizens, the Stevens family had seemed secure from further persecution. Grace immediately began organizing a response with the methodical efficiency that had made her indispensable to their rescue network. "Michael, ride to Dr. Morrison's house and tell him what's happened. Sarah, take Nathan upstairs and help him calm down while you write down everything he saw. Joshua and Joseph, I need you to ride to the Stevens bakery and see what evidence you can gather about who took them and where they might have gone." Within minutes, the Caldwell children had dispersed on their various missions, leaving Samuel and Rebecca to contemplate the implications of this brazen attack on their network. If established families like the Stevens could be seized without warning or apparent legal justification, then every family they had helped was potentially vulnerable to similar raids. "This is Stone's work," Rebecca said quietly, her voice tight with controlled fury. "He's found a way to use official authority to destroy what we've built, one family at a time." Samuel nodded grimly. The pattern was becoming clear. Their enemies had concluded that direct confrontation was less effective than systematic persecution, designed to discourage other families from seeking help or communities from providing it. By making the consequences of freedom appear more dangerous than the certainty of bondage, Stone and his allies hoped to strangle the rescue network in its cradle. Dr. Morrison arrived within the hour, his usually composed demeanor shaken by their news of the kidnapping. "I've already sent word to the Territorial Marshal's office," he announced, "but I'm not optimistic about getting official help. The men who took the Stevens family were carrying what appeared to be legitimate warrants, though nobody was allowed to examine them closely." "Warrants for what?" Grace asked, having returned from organizing search parties. "Outstanding debts from Margaret's late husband's mining obligations," Dr. Morrison replied. "Apparently someone discovered additional contracts that weren't included in our original debt settlement. The total obligation has mysteriously grown from $180 to more than $600. The fraudulent nature of these additional claims was obvious to everyone in the room, but proving fraud would require legal proceedings that could take months, while the Stevens family suffered under whatever conditions their captors had arranged. More immediately, the successful seizure would encourage similar actions against other rescued families. "We need to get them back," Michael said with the quiet determination that had become his trademark. "Not through lawyers or official channels, but directly. Today, before Stone has time to consolidate his position." Samuel stared at the 14-year-old in amazement. "Michael, what exactly are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting that if they used fake legal documents to steal the Stevens family, then we use real legal documents to get them back," Michael replied. "Grace and I have been working on something that might solve this problem permanently." Grace produced a leather portfolio from her satchel, withdrawing several official-looking documents that she spread across the kitchen table. Samuel examined them with growing astonishment, recognizing territorial forms and legal seals, but struggling to understand their significance. "What am I looking at?" he asked. "Incorporation papers for the Silver Ridge Cooperative Development Association," Grace explained. "A territorial business entity authorized to provide loans, employment opportunities, and economic development services throughout the Colorado Territory." Samuel felt his jaw drop. "You've incorporated our rescue network as an official business?" "More than that," Michael added with obvious pride. "We've obtained territorial licensing as a labor contracting agency, which means we have legal authority to negotiate employment agreements, provide worker protection services, and, if necessary, challenge improper seizures of contracted laborers." The implications were staggering. By transforming their informal rescue efforts into a legally recognized business entity, Grace and Michael had created a framework that could provide official protection for rescued families while generating sustainable revenue to fund continued operations. "How did you manage all this without anyone knowing?" Dr. Morrison asked, clearly impressed by the sophistication of their legal maneuvering. "Sarah helped with the correspondence," Grace replied. "She's been writing letters to territorial authorities for months, gathering information about business licensing requirements and legal protections for cooperative enterprises. And Michael figured out the financial structures that make everything work." The key insight, Michael explained, was realizing that territorial law actually favors business entities over individual citizens when it comes to labor disputes. A private citizen who frees indentured servants might be seen as undermining social order, but a licensed labor contractor who negotiates better working conditions is just conducting legitimate business. Samuel shook his head in wonder at the strategic thinking these children had developed. They had not only identified the legal vulnerabilities that made their rescue network susceptible to attack, but had also created institutional protections that could safeguard their work for years to come. "So how does this help us get the Stevens family back?" Rebecca asked. "Because," Grace said with a smile that suggested she had been looking forward to this moment, "the Silver Ridge Cooperative Development Association has just filed an official complaint with the territorial marshal alleging unlawful seizure of contracted workers by unauthorized persons using fraudulent documentation." She handed Samuel another document, this one bearing official seals and signatures that made it look far more authoritative than anything Stone or his allies could produce. "We've also requested immediate investigation of all debt claims against the Stevens family, along with suspension of any enforcement actions until the investigation is complete." Dr. Morrison whistled softly. "This is brilliant. You've turned their own bureaucratic weapons against them." "More than that," Michael added. "We've established legal precedent that could protect every family we've helped. Once we're officially recognized as a legitimate labor contracting agency, any attempt to seize our workers becomes a federal offense that brings in territorial marshals rather than local deputies." The transformation from desperate improvisation to systematic legal strategy represented a quantum leap in their capabilities. But Samuel understood that paperwork alone wouldn't be sufficient to rescue the Stevens family. Stone and his allies had demonstrated their willingness to ignore legal niceties when it served their purposes, and official complaints might take weeks to produce results. "Where are they being held?" Samuel asked. "According to witnesses, they were taken to Stone's ranch," Dr. Morrison replied, "supposedly to work off their debts under direct supervision." Samuel felt his anger crystallizing into cold determination. Stone's ranch was a fortress-like compound, 20 miles from Silver Ridge, isolated enough to make rescue difficult but not impossible for people who knew the territory and were willing to take calculated risks. "We're going to need help," he said quietly. "More help than our usual network can provide." The help came from an unexpected source. Other families throughout the territory who had been quietly following the Silver Ridge rescue efforts and hoping for similar opportunities in their own communities. Word of the Stevens kidnapping had spread quickly through informal networks of communication, and the response was both immediate and overwhelming. By evening, Samuel's ranch had become an impromptu headquarters for nearly 50 people, representing communities throughout the Colorado Territory. Some had traveled hundreds of miles based on nothing more than rumors that someone was finally taking action against the system of debt bondage that had trapped their neighbors and relatives. Among the arrivals were several men whose presence transformed the gathering from a planning meeting into something approaching a military operation. Thomas Mitchell, a former cavalry officer who had settled near Denver after leaving the Army, brought both tactical expertise and a grim determination to see justice done. James Crawford, a territorial judge who had become disgusted with the legal system's tolerance for exploitation, offered to provide official sanction for whatever action they decided to take. "Gentlemen," Judge Crawford announced to the assembled group, "what we're dealing with here isn't just kidnapping. It's a systematic conspiracy to subvert territorial law for private gain. I'm prepared to issue warrants for the arrest of everyone involved in this illegal seizure, but I'll need evidence and witnesses to make those warrants stick." The evidence came from an unexpected source. One of Stone's own employees, a young cowhand named Billy Martinez, who had become disgusted with his employer's increasingly criminal behavior. Billy had ridden hard from Stone's ranch to Silver Ridge with detailed information about the Stevens family's location and the security arrangements protecting their captors. They're being held in the old bunkhouse behind the main ranch buildings, Billy reported to the strategy session that had reconvened in Samuel's living room. Stone's got 6 men guarding them, but most of those men aren't comfortable with what they're doing. They signed on to work cattle, not to guard kidnapped families. "What about the legal documents Stone claims justify the seizure?" Grace asked. Billy's expression darkened with disgust. "They're forgeries, and not very good ones. Stone had them made by a clerk in Denver who specializes in creating false documentation for debt collectors. I've seen the originals. They're written on paper that's supposed to be 5 years old, but has ink that's clearly fresh." The revelation that Stone's entire operation was based on fraudulent documents simplified their tactical situation considerably. Instead of having to prove that legitimate debts were being collected improperly, they could focus on exposing criminal conspiracy and kidnapping. Judge Crawford prepared official warrants for the arrest of Stone and his accomplices, while Thomas Mitchell organized the rescue operation with military precision. Samuel found himself assigned to lead one of 3 groups that would approach Stone's ranch from different directions, creating confusion and preventing escape while minimizing the risk of violence. "Remember," Mitchell emphasized during the final briefing, "we're not vigilantes seeking revenge. We're law enforcement officers executing legitimate warrants. Our goal is to rescue the Stevens family and arrest the perpetrators with minimum risk to everyone involved." The rescue operation launched before dawn on a bitter February morning, with nearly 30 men converging on Stone's ranch through the pre-dawn darkness. Samuel rode with Grace and Michael, both of whom had insisted on participating despite the obvious dangers. "This is our network," Grace had argued when Samuel tried to convince her to stay behind. "Our friends who are in danger. We're not going to hide at home while other people take the risks." The approach to Stone's ranch revealed that Billy Martinez's intelligence had been accurate. The main buildings were lightly guarded, with most of Stone's men apparently confident that their isolated location provided sufficient security. The old bunkhouse where the Stevens family was being held stood about 100 yards behind the main house, connected by a well-worn path that would provide easy access for rescuers. Samuel's group reached their position just as the eastern sky began to lighten with the first hints of dawn. Through binoculars borrowed from Thomas Mitchell, he could see movement inside the bunkhouse and what appeared to be guards stationed at the front and rear entrances. The coordinated assault began with Judge Crawford riding up to the main house and loudly announcing that he was there to execute territorial warrants for the arrest of Jeremiah Stone and his accomplices. The announcement created exactly the confusion Mitchell had hoped for, drawing guards away from the bunkhouse to investigate what appeared to be an official law enforcement action. Samuel's group moved quickly through the resulting chaos, reaching the bunkhouse just as Stone himself emerged from the main house to confront Judge Crawford. Grace and Michael took positions to watch for approaching guards, while Samuel approached the building where the Stevens family was being held. "Margaret," he called softly through the wooden walls. "It's Samuel Hartwell. We're here to take you home." The response was immediate and heartfelt. The sound of Margaret Stevens crying with relief and her children's excited voices asking if they were really going to be rescued. Within minutes, Samuel had broken the simple lock that secured the bunkhouse door and was helping the Stevens family gather their few possessions for the journey home. The confrontation at the main house had escalated into a full-scale legal proceeding, with Judge Crawford formally arresting Stone and several of his accomplices, while Thomas Mitchell's men secured the ranch buildings and gathered evidence of the criminal conspiracy. Stone's protests about his legal authority to collect debts were systematically dismantled by the production of the forged documents Billy Martinez had described. "Mr. Stone," Judge Crawford announced with obvious satisfaction, "you are under arrest for kidnapping, fraud, conspiracy, and violation of territorial labor protection statutes. Your companions are similarly charged, and I suspect we'll find additional violations as we investigate your operations more thoroughly." The journey back to Silver Ridge became a victory procession, with the rescued Stevens family surrounded by dozens of supporters who had risked their safety to strike a blow against the system of debt bondage. Margaret Stevens rode beside Samuel, tears streaming down her face as she contemplated how close her family had come to disappearing forever into Stone's web of exploitation. "How can we ever thank you?" she asked, as Silver Ridge came into view in the distance. "By continuing to build the life you've earned," Samuel replied, "by showing other families that freedom is possible and worth fighting for." But the day's victories extended far beyond the rescue of a single family. Word of the successful operation spread quickly throughout the territory, inspiring similar efforts in other communities while demonstrating that the seemingly invincible system of debt bondage could be challenged and defeated by organized resistance. Within months, the Silver Ridge Cooperative Development Association had expanded into a territorial network with branches in 12 communities, providing legal protection and economic opportunities for hundreds of families who had previously been trapped in cycles of poverty and exploitation. Grace and Michael had become recognized experts in cooperative business development, consulted by territorial authorities who were beginning to understand that economic justice was essential for long-term social stability. Samuel found himself appointed to a territorial commission on labor reform, using his unique perspective as someone who had witnessed both the human cost of debt bondage and the practical benefits of alternative approaches. His testimony before territorial legislators helped establish new legal protections that made it much harder for unscrupulous creditors to exploit desperate families. But perhaps the most meaningful transformation was the one that occurred within Samuel's own household. The Caldwell family had evolved from refugees seeking shelter into partners in creating systemic change, each member contributing unique skills and perspectives that made their collective efforts more effective than any individual could have achieved alone. Nathan, now 6 years old, had become the unofficial mascot of rescue operations, his innocent enthusiasm helping traumatized families feel welcomed and safe in their new circumstances. The twins had developed into expert scouts and messengers, their detailed knowledge of territorial geography proving invaluable for coordinating activities across vast distances. Sarah had emerged as a gifted teacher and communicator, helping rescued families develop the literacy and numeracy skills they needed to manage their own economic affairs. Michael's business acumen had attracted attention from territorial investors who were beginning to understand that supporting cooperative enterprises could be both profitable and socially beneficial. Grace had become the acknowledged leader of the territorial network, her strategic thinking and legal expertise making her a formidable advocate for families who had previously had no voice in the systems that controlled their lives. At 19, she was already being mentioned as a potential candidate for territorial legislative office. Rebecca had found her calling as a counselor and organizer, helping traumatized families heal from their experiences while building the emotional resilience necessary for independent living. Her quiet strength and practical wisdom had made her a trusted advisor to dozens of families throughout the territory. And Samuel himself had discovered that Eleanor's challenge to do good in the world had led him not just to personal redemption, but to a life purpose that gave meaning to his grief while honoring her memory in ways he had never imagined possible. On a warm spring evening, 2 years after the auction that had started everything, Samuel stood on his porch, watching the Caldwell. Children play in the yard, while Rebecca tended Eleanor's flower garden, which had burst into spectacular bloom under her careful attention. The house was filled with the sounds of family life, but it was also filled with the satisfaction of work that mattered, of battles won and lives transformed. Dr. Morrison rode up the path toward the house, carrying news of the latest territorial legislative session, where several of their reform proposals had been adopted into law. The systematic changes they had advocated were becoming institutional reality, ensuring that future families would have protections and opportunities that had been unimaginable just a few years earlier. "You know," Dr. Morrison said as he dismounted and joined Samuel on the porch, "when you made that impulsive bid at the auction, I thought you might have lost your mind. I never imagined you were starting a revolution." Samuel smiled, thinking of Eleanor and the promise he had made to find a way to do good in the world. "Sometimes," he replied, "the most important decisions are the ones we make with our hearts instead of our heads. Sometimes the most reckless acts of compassion turn out to be the most practical investments in the future we want to create." The sun set behind the Rocky Mountain peaks, painting the sky in the brilliant colors that Eleanor had loved so much. Samuel felt the deep satisfaction of a promise kept and a life well lived. The auction that had started as an ending had become a beginning, and the family that had begun with a legal transaction had evolved into something far more precious, a chosen bond that no law could create and no force could destroy. The revolution they had started with a single act of conscience had grown into a movement that would transform the Colorado Territory for generations to come. And at its heart was the simple truth that Samuel had learned from Eleanor and passed on to the Caldwell family: that every person deserves dignity, that every family deserves security, and that love multiplied through service becomes a force powerful enough to change the world. Years later, when historians would write about the great labor reform movement of the 1880s, they would trace its origins to that cold October day when a grieving widower made an impossible bid at a debt auction in Silver Ridge. They would document the legal precedents established by the Silver Ridge Cooperative Development Association, the legislative victories won through persistent advocacy, and the thousands of families whose lives were transformed by alternatives to debt bondage. But the statistics and legal citations would never capture the true essence of what had been accomplished. They wouldn't record the sound of Nathan's laughter echoing through a house that had once been silent with grief. They wouldn't document the quiet pride in Grace's voice when she spoke at territorial legislative sessions, or the gentle patience Rebecca showed when counseling families still healing from trauma. The official histories wouldn't mention the way. Michael's eyes lit up when he solved complex financial problems that helped families achieve independence, or how Sarah's reading lessons had opened worlds of possibility for children who had never expected to learn their letters. They wouldn't capture the twins' excited reports about wildlife populations that helped ranchers make better decisions about land management, or the hundreds of small moments of connection that had transformed strangers into family. What the historians would miss was the ripple effect of hope that spread outward from Samuel's ranch like circles on a pond. Every family they helped became a beacon for others still trapped in desperation. Every successful business venture demonstrated that cooperation could triumph over exploitation. Every child who grew up free instead of bound carried the possibility of a different future into the next generation. The Silver Ridge model had inspired similar cooperatives throughout the Western Territories, creating a network of communities committed to economic justice and human dignity. Former indentured servants had become business owners, teachers, and even territorial officials, proving that circumstances of birth need not determine destiny. Samuel often thought about the moment when he had torn up those legal papers that claimed ownership of human beings. The gesture had seemed purely symbolic at the time, a dramatic statement about moral principles that mattered more than legal technicalities. But symbols, he had learned, could become seeds that grew into movements capable of reshaping entire societies. Eleanor would have been amazed by the scope of what her dying words had set in motion. Her simple challenge to do some good in the world had become a territorial transformation that touched thousands of lives and established principles that would outlive everyone who had participated in their creation. As autumn returned to the Colorado mountains and Samuel prepared for another winter with his chosen family, he felt the deep satisfaction of a life that had found its true purpose through loss, grief, and ultimately the courage to act when action seemed impossible. The auction that had changed everything was now just a memory, but its consequences would echo through generations yet to come. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.